Whether you consider it too late or right on time, the New Orleans Saints wide receiver room is finally seeing some separation. We got all that and a little bit of land for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as the Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net, which is set to debut on Sunday. So make sure you bookmark LouisianaSports.net and come and hang out with us all throughout the Saints and 49ers preseason game as the site debuts. You can also find me over at WWL TV as the station's Saints analyst. We appreciate you very much for being here for another episode. And on today's show, I'm going to tell you why some of the new things the New Orleans Saints are doing on the defensive line just simply work and how it is that they're getting it done. We're also going to take a look at the position battles both on defense and on offense. We'll get to the safety battle, which DA says no one has, quote, grabbed the bull by the horns just yet there. We'll take a look at the wide receiver room, which is finally seeing some separation behind Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed. I'm going to give you the locks at each of these positions where there are battles, those that are up next, and those that are battling for that recognition as we take a look at a bunch of different positions where these battles are taking place. That's what's coming up on today's episode. We appreciate you very much for making us your first listen and for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by friends at FanDuel, where you can make every moment more. Right now, they're giving all customers a free boost or bonus all summer long. That means that there is something for everyone every day, all throughout the summer over at FanDuel.com. Go and check them out today. The New Orleans Saints are finally seeing some separation in their wide receiver room behind Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed. And whether you think it's too late or whether you think it's right on time, it's all positive for the New Orleans Saints because they need this position to begin to not only grow and excel, but also fracture at certain points so that it's clear who deserves to be on the 53-man roster. Let me give you my locks, who's up next, and who's battling to be there, kind of in the hunt, if you will, at the position. The locks are simple, right? It's Chris Olave, it's Rashid Shaheed. There's their locks. There are no questions asked. Those guys are on the roster. Rashid Shaheed making it back to practice after dealing with an injury, now back in a non-contact jersey. Doesn't matter. He's not needed in the preseason. All good. Just practice. And now we're already starting to see that. Chris Olave, of course, is the alpha, the guy, the number one. And he has really taken in, by the way, that alpha mentality. We're seeing it a lot more now than we ever have. Behind them, the guys that are up next, wide receiver Cedric Wilson, who's actually as close to a lock without being a lock that I think you can be. And now A.T. Perry, New Orleans Saints wide receiver A.T. Perry, who they drafted in the 6th round of the 2023 NFL draft. Shocking that he was even available at that point. Everybody saw him as early day 3, maybe even a day 2 guy. Ends up being available. Saints trade up, scoop him up. I think they even traded away Adam Troutman to get there, the former tight end who they drafted out of Dayton a little bit earlier than he needed to be drafted. And they end up making that selection. He has had an embattled camp so far, but had a fantastic preseason showing against the Arizona Cardinals on Saturday, and then has followed that up with solid practices. He did leave practice early on Tuesday with an ankle injury. We'll see exactly how things go. Will he be back out there today? Will he not? Tune in to the live show later on to find out. Here are the guys that are battling for more. And this order is intentional, though it is just my opinion, and also based upon what we're seeing in terms of the deployment of these players all throughout practices too. So it's my opinion, but it's also a little educated, all right? It's an educated opinion. Kevin Austin, one of the recent additions. Stanley Morgan Jr., who also contributes as a special teamer. Bub Means is a guy they got to throw in there. Mason Tipton, Samson Nakua. And then you get to the guys that are kind of on the outside looking in, Equanimous St. Brown, Shaq Davis. I have to put Shaq Davis at the end right now because he's been there for 2 practices so far, right? Like he's just too new. I know he's got an existing relationship with the team. Let's see what happens through the preseason games and how much he's able to climb the ladder there. I think guys like Samson Nakua, Mason Tipton are making an argument for themselves to at least be practice squad guys. Bub Means has a little bit of an edge here because the fact that he's a drafted player. I think Mason Tipton in particular is a guy that could really work his way into the up next category once he gets back from injury. But I think the injury just happened at the wrong time. Okay, he's dealing with a hamstring injury right now. He was lighting up camp all camp long. We were so excited to maybe get a glimpse of him against the Arizona Cardinals. He was not able to be out there. He has not yet returned to participating in practice, though he has been around in practice. So that's something I would watch out for. It's just now he kind of has to be on the outside looking in just because of the injury. But if he's able to get back out there, it certainly can help. So by this math, the way that I would look at it is if the Saints keep 5 wide receivers, it's hard for me to say that Kevin Austin's not the 5th. It's hard for me to not argue in favor of Stanley Morgan Jr. It's hard for me to leave Bub Means out of the conversation, right? So like it would have to kind of be one of those guys as my 5th if I were making that decision right now. Bub Means gets a little bit of an edge because, like I said, he's a drafted player, but he's been nursing an injury, so that might make it a little bit tough to throw him on the roster as of right now. But Kevin Austin, Stanley Morgan Jr., guys that contribute on special teams and have been making plays at wide receiver, I think those are 2 guys that are worth watching Sunday as the Saints take on the San Francisco 49ers. All right, let's run over to running back now, no pun intended, because there's still an enormous gap and you're waiting for an obvious RB2 to stand out. Lock is Alvin Kamara, the one and only lock at the position. The guys that are up next, Jamal Williams. I could put Jamal Williams as a lock. I think he's going to be on the roster. I think people are kind of overinflating the idea that he might not be on the roster, but who knows? The Saints have made some surprising decisions at roster cuts before. We've certainly seen that. Also in the up next category, I would put Jordan Mims and James Robinson. Both guys have been very, very impressive here throughout camp. Battling for more, it has to be Jacob Kibodi. Not that he's looked poor or that he's looked bad at all. He's just behind the other guys at the moment. And then injured is Kendre Miller. We don't know where Kendre Miller fits in right now. I think he's going to make the roster, but I don't know if he's going to be ready to go at the beginning of the season. I mean, we just have no idea at this point. So if we don't see him in the preseason, it's really hard to not make the argument to at least throw him on injured reserve at the beginning of the year, give him some time, and then get him going. I don't know. It's really disappointing because that gap between Alvin Kamara and then Jamal Williams, Jordan Mims, James Robinson is so wide that if like Kendre Miller were out here having a decent camp, he would be making a big time claim for RB2. And he's just unfortunately not able to do that because he's been injured since literally the first day of practice. Like he has missed all of training camp so far, and that's not ideal. Left guard, I think, is solidified. I think we know Lucas Patrick is the starting left guard as far as I'm concerned. I would be shocked if it was anything other than that, barring injury. We just don't know what's going on with Nick Saldiveri. Dennis Allen telling us today in his media availability after practice on Tuesday that they're not sure that Nick Saldiveri will see any time during the preseason. I don't know how you make a roster that way. I think he's got to go either on injured reserve at the beginning of the year, or you're going to have to figure out something with him. I mean, obviously you want to keep him because he's a draft asset. Maybe you keep him as a depth guy. I don't know, but he's certainly not going to be able to be a starter here. And that's really disappointing because Nick Saldiveri was feeling really good coming into the year after that shoulder injury. And then now he's dealing with all this stuff and he hasn't been able to get back out on the field. And then finally, tight end 3, maybe not as much of a battle, really. I think we all expect that this is the case, but I just wanted to confirm that for me, Dallin Holker is still very much in the lead. And then up next when it comes to that conversation is still Michael Jacobson, who I think would be a prime priority, whatever other P word you want to come up with, positive one, practice squad guy. I think that's who he's going to be. And I think that's going to be awesome for him. All right, coming up next, I want to take a look at the defense because Dennis Allen said, no one's grabbing the bull by the horns next to Tyrann Mathieu. So who's going to earn that role? We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by friends at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, and our official sports betting partners here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Absolutely the place you should go if you want to start getting in on all of the betting action that's available. The MLB continues to roll along. You got WNBA on the way back, just wrapped up the Olympics. We've also got NFL preseason and the NFL season on the way. So much to get involved in over at FanDuel, and they're making it even better for you right now, because this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a free boost or bonus every day. That means that there is something for everyone every day, all summer long over at FanDuel.com. So head over to FanDuel.com today so you can start making the most out of your summer. You want to go and put a bet on the New Orleans Saints winning their opening game against the Carolina Panthers. Go and check out FanDuel today and see what the booster bonus is, because it might actually help you out in that circumstance. Go and check it out, FanDuel.com, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, family, the safety position next to Tyrann Mathieu still very much sounds like it is up for grabs after Dennis Allen kind of gives a little bit of a challenge to those at the position that are battling to win that spot. We appreciate you very much. As always, making Locked On Saints a part of your day and a part of your routine, making us your first listen of the day. Don't forget to go and check out Michelle Majuk and Vinny Iyer every single Monday through Friday over at Locked On Fantasy Football, doing a great job making sure you're all caught up and able to win your fantasy football leagues. Go and check them out over at Locked On Fantasy Football, wherever you get your podcast, and on YouTube. You part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So when we take a look at the safety position next to Tyrann Mathieu, we kind of touched on this the other day. Jonathan Abram, Jordan Howden, those are the guys that are most uniquely positioned to win that role. Jonathan Abram and Jordan Howden both started next to Tyrann Mathieu last year, so there's literal tape for the team to be able to look back at and say, okay, we like this guy doing this, we like this guy doing this, now let's see what they do in training camp. The issue seems to be that seeing what they're doing in training camp, there hasn't been enough separation between either of those two guys or the others that are part of the conversation. So we're going to do the same thing that we did over on the offensive side here with the defensive side that we're talking about. We'll take a look at who's battling, who's up next, and who's a lock. But I want to highlight Dennis Allen here just for a moment. Dennis Allen saying in Tuesday's media availability after practice that no one at the position has, quote, grabbed the bull by the horns just yet. This is another challenge to this position, and we've seen Dennis Allen challenge a lot of players this offseason, and I think it's a good thing. He challenged Kendre Miller to find a way to stay on the field. Hasn't been able to do that yet. Kind of challenged Nick Saldiveri for the same thing. Again, called into question both those guys' abilities to make the roster, not just win a starting role or win a bigger role or anything like that. Literally talked about them making the roster as something that would be impacted by their health. We saw a little bit of a call out on A.T. Perry saying that he was fine. He's been doing fine over the course of training camp, and then following it up with basically saying that fine's not good enough, right? So lots of these little things to where you're seeing kind of these little call outs and things like that. And I've had people ask me, I talked about this with John Hendricks over on Second and Saints as well. But I have had people ask me, do I think that this is a bad thing? That Dennis Allen is like calling players out and all these other things. And then now you add in this safety situation where he's like, hey, it's still open. Nobody's going for it. He even mentioned Trevor Penning the other day as he's not ready to commit to Trevor Penning at right tackle. And honestly, how could you be? So is this a bad thing? I don't think so. I think this is a great thing. A couple of years ago, you remember Alvin Kamara telling us in the locker room that he was upset about the fact that there is not a see something, say something culture within the Saints practices and preparation and all those other things. Talked about how fumbling and all that kind of stuff just kind of goes unaddressed in practices and everything. And that has led to fumbles in games. He talked about accountability again before training camp this year, or rather the first day of training camp this year when he did his amazing media availability with New Orleans media. He was outstanding at the podium. Now you're seeing the opposite of that. You're seeing these guys get called to task, and you would rather the latter than you'd rather the former in all cases. You'd rather hear them called to task. You'd rather hear them held accountable. You'd rather hear them challenged. The New Orleans Saints have made competition a big part of what they're doing over the course of this training camp. And that competition could sometimes be against other guys at the same position, like Jordan Howden and Jonathan Abram. It could also be about challenging them with guys that are directly opposite them, a wide receiver having to be covered by a safety having to cover a wide receiver, whatever it might be, one-on-ones, all those other things, competition. But you can also generate competition internally by saying, hey, that player is not performing up to standard. That's what he did with A.T. Perry. That's what they did with Kendre Miller. That's what they did with Nick Saldiveri. That's what they did with Trevor Penning. That's what they're doing with Jordan Howden as well as Jonathan Abram by saying neither one of them have separated yet. So now here's an opportunity for them to go and separate. Here's the way that I look at it so far. The players that are locked to make the roster, along with Tyrann Mathieu, very obviously Jonathan Abram, Jordan Howden, JT Gray. I think I would put all three of them there. JT Gray making it as a special teams guy and potential special teams captain repeat there. That's a pretty easy one for me. Up next, Will Harris, who absolutely has to be a part of the conversation. And then you've got guys that are battling for that recognition, such as Lawrence Johnson. And then there's Ugo Amadi, who's been dealing with injury here recently. The wild card is still Justin Simmons. Justin Simmons, who is currently visiting or expected to visit with the Atlanta Falcons, visited with the New Orleans Saints, left without a contract. That's not surprising. I would be shocked if Justin Simmons signs a contract anywhere before either the second preseason game is over or the preseason as a whole are done, because why put yourself in a position where you might be asked to play? No reason to do that. So it still seems to me a battle between Jonathan Abram and Jordan Howden. The distribution of snaps for Jonathan Abram and Jordan Howden against the Arizona Cardinals on Saturday's game seemed to suggest that Jonathan Abram is currently still positioned as the starter. We've always talked about this as Jonathan Abram's role to lose, right? It's all his as long as he doesn't lose it. I think that's still the way that things are trending at the moment. But Jordan Howden's going to continue to get more and more opportunities, continue to get more and more looks. So watch on Sunday, who's the starting safety next to Tyrann Mathieu. I think that will tell you a lot. And of course, we'll keep an eye on this battle throughout the next 3 practice days, because these are going to be big practice days for these guys, especially after the call out happened on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday practices. Here's your opportunity to respond. So I think the Saints are going to be happy with whoever it is that comes out, but here's what they want. They want somebody to come out and win the role, not just default into it, not just hold on to it. They want somebody to come in and win this role. Here's an opportunity over the course of the next 3 days to do that. I think ultimately it would be Jonathan Abram. Ultimately, veteran experience, a little bit more of a box safety, which is a little bit of what they're looking for next to Tyrann Mathieu, while Jordan Howden has more time to grow, has more time to learn that position, but is a little bit more of a deep safety, a little bit more of a reserve or like a backup behind Tyrann Mathieu, and then the future after Tyrann Mathieu at that position. That's kind of the way that I look at it. What about cornerbacks? There's been a little bit of a battle at cornerback. It's not really been about the top 4 guys, right? We know who the locks are: Marshawn Lattimore, Paulson Adebo, Alontae Taylor, Kool-Aid McKinstry. Easy. But typically the Saints keep a 5th guy. Now, there has been some reference of battles between guys like Kool-Aid McKinstry and Paulson Adebo on the outside, Kool-Aid McKinstry and Alontae Taylor on the outside. Paulson Adebo and Alontae Taylor very well solidified in terms of what it is they're going to do, especially Alontae Taylor. I told you like the 2nd or 3rd day of camp. I can't remember which day it was. But if you're an everydayer, you heard me do a whole segment on how Alontae Taylor is a different player this training camp. A very, very different player. And we have continued to see nothing but that. The opposite of all the call outs we were just talking about from Dennis Allen has been the praise that Alontae Taylor continues to get and absolutely deserves. Here are the guys, though, that are up next. Here are the ones that are fighting for that 5th cornerback spot. I'll throw Shamar Jean-Charles on there. He's always been on the list for me. Great special teamer, able to contribute. That's typically a special team spot, CB5, but you got to be able to contribute a little bit on defense too. And we've seen him walk away with a few interceptions this training camp. And then I want to throw Rico Payton in there. You know what? Dang it. Rico Payton is somebody that has struggled like crazy all throughout training camp, constantly picked on, constantly targeted, giving up catches, all this other stuff. And then shows up in this preseason game and allows 1 catch on 6 targets and plays like a dog. And I loved it. I loved it. Shout out to Rico Payton for doing that. So I'm throwing him in the mix at the up next category. The guys that are battling, Rejzon Wright, and then the newly added Caleb Ford Dimont, who came in and was added when the Saints moved on from Xander Horvath. I think that has a lot more to do with them being skinny at cornerback than it has to do with Xander Horvath. Wouldn't be surprised to see Xander Horvath back at some point once the team is healthy again at corner. Mac McCain is also in the conversation, but is dealing with injury at the moment. And by the way, when it comes to kicker and punter, I think it's still up in the air. I think we learn a lot come San Francisco this weekend. All right. Coming up next, I want to tell you why the new things the New Orleans Saints are doing on the defensive line are working. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. I come on here all the time and I tell you all about how much I care about mental health and how much therapy has helped me. It hasn't just helped me. It's helped people around me as well. And I'm talking about really help people around me. So I highly recommend, if you have not tried therapy, that you try it. and that you give it a shot. Or at least if you've been thinking about it, you should absolutely make it a self-care non-negotiable, something that you don't want to give up on. You know what I mean? Like you might feel like you've got some free time and stuff like that every now and then. And these non-negotiables like therapy are important to fit into that free time every now and then, right? You might be free, you might have a little bit of time, but are you really maximizing that time? Therapy can absolutely help you do that. So here's what I want you to do. All right. I want you to go to betterhelp.com/lockedon today, and you'll get 10% off. You'd never skip a therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints are doing some new and interesting things over on the defensive line, and I want to highlight why they work, why I like them. We're going to dive in through all of that. And one of them is really like a thing we're going to spend the most time talking about, which is Cam Jordan and Payton Turner taking snaps on the inside, not moving to defensive tackle, but taking snaps on the inside and why it works. So I want to break all this down as we continue on here and wrap up today's episode. Forgive me for being irresponsible. I had a note to myself to start the show with a quick thing on the quarterbacks, right? We're talking about position battles. Irresponsible of me not to talk about QB2 first, Jake Haener, Spencer Rattler. But here's the thing, neck and neck, right? These next couple preseason games, those are going to be the delineating factors. But I think Spencer Rattler helped himself a lot in the conversation with, of course, leading the game-winning drive. But the experience of Jake Haener and the rebound of Jake Haener all throughout training camp so far has been great. So don't want to leave that out. I'm sorry. I meant to start with that and I didn't. That's irresponsible of me. I apologize. All right. So a couple of things the New Orleans Saints are doing differently on their defensive line that I think are really interesting. If you're an insider, you've been hearing me, you probably, you got a message from me about this during the preseason game. But I want to start off with a look at something different, which is Cam Jordan, Payton Turner taking snaps on the inside. This is interesting, right? Cam Jordan played 15 snaps on the interior last year, according to Pro Football Focus. Payton Turner didn't really take a lot of snaps on the inside. There's like one or two that you can look at in which he took a snap at 3 tech down to 0 tech. So just a quick refresher on the techniques. 0 tech is a defensive tackle that's lined up over the center, face to face, nose to nose with the center, also called a nose tackle for that very reason. 1 tech is 1 gap over to where you're lined up between the center and the guard. And then 3 tech is another full gap over, not a half gap, but a full gap over where you're lined up in between the guard and the tackle. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about 0, 1, or 3 tech. Typically, the guy that's lined up at 0 or 1 is a run stopper. Typically, the guy that's lined up at the 3 is a pass rusher. I think Brian Brzee versus Colin Saunders. I think Brian Brzee versus Christian Boyd, probably more appropriately. So when you think about it, moving Cam Jordan on the inside, moving Payton Turner on the inside could have some value, right? These NASCAR packages that we constantly talk about, which feature instead of 2 defensive ends on the outside and 2 defensive tackles on the inside, 2 defensive ends on the outside and 1 defensive tackle and 1 defensive end playing that 3 tech spot. Gives you more speed, gives you all these other things. So let's break that down, right? This is one of the things that we've seen working. Why is it working? What does it do? Why do that? Well, I'll tell you. It switches up a little bit of how the interior offensive line that you're competing with as a defensive line it switches up how they have to block, right? They're used to, throughout a game, having to block the big 300 plus pound guy that maybe is a little fleet of foot, but isn't rushing the same way, doesn't have the same rush plan as an edge guy that's rushing from the interior. So you're kind of pulling the interior offensive line back on their heels a little bit, giving them something that they now have to adjust to on the fly in the moment, right? So you're taking that guard that has been pushed around and beat up by a big defensive tackle, and you're saying, all right, now counter this speed right here. And so you're making things a little bit tougher on them, right? So that would be a big thing. Speed is another thing. You're adding speed to your pass rush attack. On a clear and obvious passing down, like a 3rd and 10, 3rd and 7, whatever, you want to add some more speed on your defensive line. Here's a way to do it, right? You get your guys, we'll use the Saints as an example here. Carl Granderson on one side, Chase Young on the other side, and then in some configuration, Brian Brzee and Cam Jordan, or Brian Brzee and Payton Turner on the inside. Or you have Cam Jordan on the outside, then you move Chase Young to the inside. Or you have Chase Young out off the field. Or you have Chase Young on one side, Carl Granderson off the field, Cam Jordan on the other side, and then Payton Turner in the middle. So many different things that you can do here, right? And every time that you shuffle and move those guys around and somebody new lines up over that offensive lineman that has already played 50 plus snaps, you're making that guy's life HE double hockey sticks, and that makes things a little bit more complicated for that offensive lineman. You see what I'm saying? While the offensive lineman's out there wearing and tearing for play after play after play after play, and then all of a sudden he goes from having a 300-pound bull rusher in front of him to a 270-pound finesse rusher in front of him. He's got to change everything mentally about how he approaches that rep. And he has no idea that that's happening either until he sees the defensive huddle or breaks the offensive huddle, turns around and goes to the line and sees, oh, that's 94. That's a different person. These are the types of things that you're trying to do. You're trying to get people kind of off their heels, mess with the mentals, all those other things. Here's the other thing that I like about having that, right? The defensive end on the inside. It makes your ability to utilize twists and stunts way cleaner when you have a defensive end doing that. Not that defensive tackles can't run it, but let's say that you're the guard, right? I am Cam Jordan. I am half of Cam Jordan, maybe a quarter of Cam Jordan. I literally was talking to Cam today and I was like looking up the entire time. It was like it was like being a little kid. It was so funny. But having that arrangement, right? Do you know for sure that I'm rushing directly at you, or might I stunt outside while Chase Young flies to your face instead? And how do you react to that? Does that suck for you? Yeah, that kind of sucks for you, dude. Like, that's not great. And so those are the little things that I think you also get kind of like the intricacy of and the nuance of, which is that this just creates real havoc for an offensive lineman that might be a little ill prepared, or a second string interior offensive lineman that is filling in for a injured starter who got injured last game, and this guy, or during practice, and this guy's had a day of practice. Okay. Attack, right? You see what I'm saying? So it creates all those kinds of things. And remember that we've seen this work before. Tyrann Mathieu played over 150 snaps at a 0 to 3 tech alignment, 0, 1, or 3, right? Lined up on the inside. Not necessarily meaning, and the reason why I make that delineation, by the way, is because sometimes the outermost defensive lineman of the 4 was Tyrann Mathieu, but he was lined up on an inside gap. So they're either like really condensed in the middle and then have one person on the wide outside on the opposite side, and then maybe they have a stand-up edge rusher over on the other side, like all these other things. So there's lots of different ways to discuss. So I'm making the delineation of him not necessarily being a defensive tackle, because he might still be the end technically based on the numbers of the defensive lineman, but he's lined up on the inside. So over 150 of those alignments, two and a half of his 3.5 sacks came from those alignments. 18 of his 34 pressures, more than half, came from those alignments. You have to replace that because, as Dennis Allen said during Tuesday's presser, or media availability rather, after the Saints practice, Tyrann Mathieu is not going to be available for the beginning of the season. And that should be a shock to no one, right? Coming off that Achilles injury, everything like that. Like, we all knew that. But so you want to replace those snaps. You want to replace that efficiency. And that's where guys like that's where guys like Cam Jordan, as well as Payton Turner, have the ability to have that level of impact. Here's the other thing that I think the New Orleans Saints have done that was interesting. And here's something that the insiders got during Saturday's game, is utilizing Bryan Bresee and Nathan Shepard together on reps. Those are both typically the 3 tech penetrator type pass rusher types at defensive tackle. Whereas Colin Saunders and Christian Boyd have been those guys that are usually the run stoppers in the middle, but that can also contribute as pass rushers. I don't want to diminish their ability to pass rush. So seeing both Bryan Bresee and Nathan Shepard on the field at the same time is also unique because, again, speed. A lot of speed, a lot of attacking ability there. So curious about that as well. We'll have to see just how that develops. But I just want to give you an in-depth breakdown on the defensive ends playing on the inside, or the NASCAR package, and why it's of value. Thanks. Thanks for listening. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Appreciate you very much, as always, making us your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, we'll be live later on today. It'll be a little bit of a later one. It's my Wednesday meeting day, so it'll probably be around 5:30 or so before we go live Central Time and everything like that, but we'll get it to you. And then, fresh episodes every single day. We appreciate you very much. As always, making us your first listen. Don't forget to go and check out Locked On Pelicans, Jake Madison and Matt Moscona over at Locked On LSU. And of course, we appreciate you very much for making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.